Welcome to my channel.
The wind whipped across the hills like an impatient tailor, tugging at Hamish Macbeth's coat and rattling the windows of Whodunit. Snowflakes, fat and lazy, drifted down from a sky the colour of wet slate, settling on the roof of the village hall and the frozen surface of the loch. Hamish, snug in the warm interior of the Whodunit Arms, nursed a cup of coffee that had already gone tepid and scowled at the telephone beside him. "You're needed, Hamish," the voice on the line had said earlier, one of those insistent voices from Strathbane which never understood the subtle art of doing nothing sensibly. He'd hung up without saying a word, promising himself that the next caller would find an answering machine and a note that read, "Gone fishing, back when convenient." Towser, his dog, was curled in a tight ball at the foot of the radiator, snoring with the satisfaction of one who had not the slightest care for murders or missing persons. Hamish envied him. The day promised nothing but wind, snow, and the slow comfort of avoiding work. That was, until the door banged open, and in swept the latest disturbance to Whodunit's peaceful rhythm, a Sassenach. She was tall, impossibly neat despite the driving snow, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that made locals instinctively cross the street. In her wake, her fox fur collar left a trail of snowflakes that melted on the polished floor. "Hello," she said, her voice clipped, like the kind of voice that had been trained to command boardrooms and not listen to the soft lilt of Highland speech. "I'm Clarissa Fairclough. I've just bought Heatherbank House, and I expect—" She paused, glanced around, and added in a tone meant to sting, "everything to run smoothly." Hamish pretended to look interested, leaning on the counter, one eyebrow higher than the other. Towser shifted and growled softly, sensing an intruder's arrogance. "Smoothly, eh?" Hamish murmured to himself. "Well, that's a tall order in Whodunit, even the snow." Disobeys orders. The hotel's owner, Mrs. Biggs, bustled over with a tray of scones, sending the newcomer's glare ricocheting off the walls. "Oh, you'll find Whodunit does things at its own pace, miss. But a wee cup of tea might help ye settle in." Clarissa barely looked at the scones. "Tea? Yes, well, if I must." Hamish sipped his coffee and considered. Outsiders were like this, impatient, loud, and unable to understand the delicate balance of Highland life. Most of them left eventually, muttering about quaintness or lack of services. But some had a habit of staying long enough to upset the natural order. And, as Hamish already suspected, Clarissa Fairclough would be one of those. The door opened again, letting in a gust of freezing air that whipped snow into a small blizzard around her polished boots. Behind her came a man with the look of someone who had spent too long in office towers and too little in the fresh wind. Hamish noted the way he scanned the room, like a hawk checking for mice. He'd meet that man later, probably in a context he wouldn't enjoy. But for now, Hamish had plans. He was meant to be doing nothing of consequence, and the snow outside invited a slow, thoughtful wander. There was salmon to be poached, tea to be drunk, and the comforting knowledge that in Whodunit even the most irritating outsiders could be observed without having to intervene. Still, as Hamish poured another cup of coffee, he couldn't help the faint twitch of unease in his stomach. Something about this newcomer didn't fit with the rhythm of the village, and in Whodunit, when things didn't fit, trouble was never far behind. Little did he know, the trouble in question was about to arrive sooner than anyone could have imagined, on a quiet, snow-dusted Christmas morning. The morning drifted slowly into afternoon, the snow turning from soft flakes into a steady, insistent fall, covering the village in a blanket of white that made every sound softer and every step more careful. Hamish Macbeth lingered by the window of the Whodunit Arms, nursing his second cup of coffee and watching the snow swirl around the newcomers as they explored the village, their polished boots leaving neat impressions in the unbroken white. Towser padded restlessly at his side, nose twitching at scents the snow could not entirely hide. Hamish, in contrast, was content to observe. The less he moved, the more he could learn, and he had learned long ago that Whodunit had a way of revealing its secrets to those willing to sit and notice. By mid-afternoon, he had reluctantly put down his mug and pulled on his coat. There was, after all, the small matter of the salmon in the river, and the thought of it made him ignore the chill. Towser leapt ahead eagerly, though the dog's enthusiasm was matched by the clatter of boots and voices from the hotel as Clarissa Fairclough and her companion made their way through the village. Hamish smirked as he watched them, her nose held high, surveying every crooked fence and frost-dusted gate as if she owned the entire Highlands. He had almost convinced himself to forget the new arrivals and enjoy the river when the first scream shattered the gentle hush of the snow. It was not the usual yelp of a startled animal or a child lost in the drifts. It was sharp, piercing, and carried the unmistakable edge of genuine terror. Hamish's coffee-hardened heart skipped. He exchanged a look with Towser, who growled low in his throat, and, with a resigned sigh, realised that his day of doing nothing had just ended. By the time Hamish reached the village green, a small crowd had gathered, bundled in scarves and hats, forming a semicircle that left a space in the centre. There, on the snow, lay Clarissa Fairclough herself, or rather what was left of her morning composure. Her coat, normally immaculate, was dusted with snow and dirt, twisted at odd angles. Her expression was frozen in shock, eyes staring upward at the grey sky. It was clear she would not rise again. Hamish's stomach sank, not out of horror. He had seen death enough in the quiet and harsh parts of the Highlands, but because it meant bureaucracy, paperwork, and the inevitable arrival of Strathbane. He dropped to his knees beside the body, careful not to disturb anything yet observant in a way only Hamish could manage. Clarissa's scarf was torn slightly at the clasp, the buttons on her gloves mismatched, details that, to others, might have seemed trivial, but to him whispered clues. "Did you see what happened?" one of the villagers asked, their voice shaky. Hamish stood slowly, brushing snow from his coat. "Aye," he murmured, keeping his voice low. "Something happened, and it happened quickly. But panicking won't help. Best step back now, eh?" Towser nudged against his leg as if agreeing. The villagers shuffled, uncertain, some muttering about accidents, others daring to speak her name aloud for the first time. Hamish noted their faces, each revealing more than they intended. There was Mrs. Biggs, visibly pale, clutching the edges of her apron as if it could shield her from the spectacle. The postmistress, Mrs. Duncanson, pressed her hands together tightly, eyes flicking from the body to Hamish, a silent plea that he manage what the village feared to acknowledge. The crunch of heavy boots on packed snow heralded the arrival of DCI Blair and his team, who appeared as though transported from a different world, one of shouting, red faces and imperious assumptions. Blair, a man whose presence alone seemed capable of stirring chaos, strode forward, face as red as a boiled lobster, flanked by two sergeants whose expressions were somewhere between irritation and horror. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice bouncing off the frost-coated stone of the village green. "Step aside, you useless peasant. We'll take it from here." Hamish, hands in pockets, allowed a faint smile. Blair would never understand that the real work lay in noticing the tiny, almost imperceptible inconsistencies. He simply ignored the order to move, his eyes scanning the scene with patient thoroughness. Towser barked once, low and warning, as though reinforcing the sentiment that some authority should indeed be questioned. Blair bent over the body theatrically, poking at the edges of the coat and muttering about motives and obvious suspects. Drunk? Angry husband? Local troublemakers? He barked to no one in particular, already settling on the first-glance theory, one that always seemed to satisfy him more than facts ever could. "Macbeth, fetch some witnesses. We can't have villagers muddying the investigation with gossip." Hamish merely tilted his head, noting a smear of mud on Clarissa's polished boot, the way her fur collar had been disturbed, unevenly, and the subtle indentation of a handprint in the snow nearby. Each small detail told a story Blair would dismiss without a second glance. While the official investigation floundered, Hamish allowed himself a slow wander around the green, Towser padding silently at his heels. The villagers followed hesitantly, and some began whispering about what they had seen, or thought they had. Hamish exchanged nods and soft murmurs with familiar faces, the curry shop owner who always knew what everyone ate for breakfast, the minister who had eyes everywhere in the churchyard, and Mrs. Biggs, who had a peculiar talent for overhearing the worst secrets over a cup of tea. Through these casual, almost accidental conversations, Hamish began to sketch a picture of Clarissa Fairclough that the official inquiry had not yet considered. She had argued heatedly with the previous caretaker of Heatherbank House. She had openly scoffed at local traditions during her first visit, and she had been trying to secure a deal for a local property that did not belong to her. Each piece of information, seemingly trivial, hinted at tension, resentment, and the possibility that someone in the village, or newly introduced into it, had more reason to see her gone than Blair's obvious suspect list suggested. As the sky darkened and the snow thickened, Hamish realised that the simplicity of the morning had dissolved into complication. The village's quiet charm now carried a sinister undertone, and he, despite his inclination for inaction, could not ignore it. Each step in the snow, each whispered conversation, and every cautious glance at the gathering crowd fed a growing certainty in him. Clarissa Fairclough had entered Lochdu as a storm, and that storm had claimed her life before the snow could even settle. Hamish returned to the body, crouching again with Towser's head resting lightly on his knee. He glanced around at the villagers, their breath misting in the cold air, their eyes wide and uncertain. Blair barked orders that seemed increasingly irrelevant to Hamish's quiet calculation. He studied the pattern of snow round the body, the uneven footprints, the disturbed earth at the edge of the green, and the faint smudge of mud along the hem of her coat. In that moment, he knew, the truth of what had happened would not come from shouting, paperwork, or obvious guilt. It would come from the overlooked, the whispered, and the observed, and if anyone could uncover it, it would be him, slow, unassuming, and deceptively lazy, while Blair flailed like a red-faced storm cloud above, convinced that authority alone could solve the problem. Hamish sipped his coffee again, already cold, and allowed a faint smirk to curve his lips. The game was on, whether the village realised it or not, and in the Highlands, he mused, the quiet always held more power than the loud, and somewhere beneath the falling snow, he could feel the first thread of a secret beginning to unravel. The wind had eased slightly by the next morning, leaving the village of Lochdu wrapped in an almost eerie stillness. Snow lay thick on the rooftops, draped over fences, and muffled the usual sounds of livestock and footsteps, creating a silence that made every creak of a gate or shuffle of a boot feel louder than it ought. Hamish Macbeth moved through the village at a leisurely pace, coat collar turned up against the lingering chill, and Towser padding loyally at his side. The official investigation, as predicted, was a noisy disaster. DCI Blair, red-faced and spluttering, barked at villagers, questioned witnesses in an impatient and scattershot manner, and repeatedly dismissed Hamish with gestures so grand they threatened to knock the lad over. Blair had already decided, before breakfast even, that the local handyman, Dougal Fraser, was the most likely culprit. Dougal was an affable fellow with a tendency to grumble about the new rich who bought property in Lochdu without understanding the land, which apparently made him guilty in Blair's eyes. Hamish, watching from a discreet distance as Blair interrogated Dougal, allowed himself a faint smirk. The man's guilt was about as real as the snow melting in spring. Hamish, who had spent the better part of yesterday observing, had noted the faint but telling details. The misplaced footprints, the subtle impressions of a smaller handprint near Heatherbank's gate, and the glint of something metallic partially buried in the snow at the edge of the green. None of it fit Dougal Fraser. Hamish decided the best approach was, as always, to mooch, quietly, with a cup of tea in hand or a plate of scones for good measure, through the village and gather information while Blair made the kind of noise only a Strathbane detective could. He stopped first at the post office, where Mrs. Duncanson greeted him with a soft smile and a knowing look that suggested she already suspected he would be meddling, as usual. "Morning, Hamish," she said, offering a tin of shortbread with her usual sly cheer. "You'll be wanting the gossip along with the tea, eh?" Hamish accepted a biscuit and sipped his tea, letting the warmth spread through him while he leaned against the counter in a manner that suggested casual interest. "Aye, that's the plan," he murmured. "Seems the village has had a disturbance overnight." Mrs. Duncanson lowered her voice and leaned in. "It's more than that. That Clarissa Fairclough. She had more enemies than friends in a single morning. The caretaker she replaced, Mrs. MacLeod, has been grumbling for weeks about being ousted. And there's young Jeremy Cameron. He took her criticisms to heart, I think." Hamish nodded slowly, noting the names. He asked casual questions, as though distracted by the teapot, But every response from Mrs. Duncanson added another layer to the picture. Clarissa's behaviour in the village had rubbed almost everyone the wrong way, but it was subtle things that mattered. Small slights, sharp words over the sale of a property, whispered criticisms in the shop, even the way she had dismissed the traditions of the Christmas market. By mid-morning, Hamish had made his way to the curry shop, where Mrs. Core greeted him with steaming cups of chai and an appreciative nod. "Hamish, you're looking for warmth and conversation, eh?" she said, sliding a cup across the counter. "The new lady, she made a scene already. I heard she argued with Dougal yesterday about the fencing at Heatherbank. Something about it not being straight, can you imagine?" Hamish chuckled softly. "Straight fences are not often the measure of a person's character, but they can cause ill feeling," he murmured, sipping the chai. He watched the village through the window as Blair and his sergeants continued their heavy-handed questioning outside. The sergeants looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot as they demanded explanations for every minor detail, and Blair himself had begun gesturing wildly at the accumulating snow, apparently convinced it contained the crime scene evidence itself. Hamish allowed himself a brief pause, thinking of Elspeth Grant, who'd been visiting from Inverness the previous week. She had a knack for observing social dynamics in a way that even Hamish sometimes underestimated. If she were here, she would have noticed the tension between the village insiders and the newcomers, the unspoken grudges that simmered beneath polite smiles. Hamish sipped his chai thoughtfully, allowing a plan to form in his mind. As the afternoon wore on, he wandered back toward Heatherbank House, ostensibly to check on the grounds, but really to observe subtle details Blair and his team were missing. The snow made it easier. Footprints and small disturbances were visible against the otherwise smooth white canvas. Hamish crouched near the garden gate, Towser sniffing carefully around the edges, and his eyes caught a small, scuffed bootprint that did not belong to Clarissa, Dougal, or any of the police. Beside it, the metal glint he had seen the day before now revealed itself fully. A cufflink, modest but engraved with a family crest, partially hidden under a dusting of snow. Hamish's mind worked quietly but quickly. The cufflink was too fine to belong to the ordinary villagers, and too small to match the gloved hands of most of the adults he had observed. Whoever it belonged to had been in the garden recently, likely at the exact moment that Clarissa had been confronted. Or worse, it was the sort of detail Blair would dismiss as insignificant, and that was exactly why Hamish made a mental note to track it carefully. The sound of footsteps on the snow drew him to his feet, and he turned to see Mrs. Biggs approaching, shawl tight around her shoulders. "Hamish, I ken you'll be looking into things, but mind you don't get yourselves caught in Blair's storm. That man's like a thunderclap in winter. No subtlety at all." "Aye, I ken," Hamish said, tucking the cufflink carefully into his pocket. "He'll shout, he'll gesture, and he'll blame someone for everything. But the truth, Mrs. Biggs, that tends to hide in the quiet corners." The baker nodded, her eyes scanning the snow-laden grounds. "You always were clever. Hamish, even if you do nothing most days, just mind the snow, eh? It hides a lot more than it shows." Hamish smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth twitching. Indeed, the snow hid as much as it revealed, and it would take time, patience, and careful observation to tease the truth from the white blanket. But that was precisely why Hamish Macbeth was suited to Whodunit. While Blair blustered and shouted, Hamish moved with the quiet, patient precision of a man who knew that, in the Highlands, the smallest clue often led to the largest revelations. Towser nudged him toward the village again, as if reminding him that while snow and secrets might conceal evidence, life, and the people who carried stories, continued. And Hamish, letting the afternoon stretch languidly around him, realized that solving this mystery would require all of his deceptively lazy cunning. Each conversation, each observation, each small unnoticed detail would be a step toward understanding the motive and the means behind Clarissa Fairclough's sudden and disturbing end. By evening, the village had settled into a tense quiet, punctuated only by Blair's continuing exclamations and the occasional crunch of snow underfoot as Hamish made his rounds, collecting scraps of information and arranging them carefully in his mind. The picture was beginning to form. It was not a crime of opportunity or drunken rage, but something far more deliberate. And as he paused once more at the edge of the loch, watching the icy water reflect the dimming light, Hamish knew that the next day would bring answers, or at least the first threads of a truth that Blair could neither see nor understand. The snow fell more gently now, dusting his shoulders, and Hamish allowed himself a rare smile. In Whodunit, the quiet always spoke louder than shouting, and he, as always, would listen. The next morning dawned with a faint pink light spilling over the snow-capped hills, though the chill in the air remained stubbornly persistent. Hamish Macbeth emerged from the Whodunit arms with Towser padding beside him, the dog's breath misting in tiny clouds that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The village seemed to hold its breath, wary of the investigation that had now become the talk of every household. Windows were cautiously opened to observe Blair and his sergeants as they hovered around Heatherbank House, still convinced that Dougal Fraser's grumbling amounted to motive. Hamish, naturally, kept his distance. Blair had the kind of voice that could carry all the way to the loch and beyond, and it did, but it rarely carried any insight. Hamish's morning walk took him past the church, where the minister was attempting to reassure parishioners that prayer, while never a bad thing, could not replace common sense or police work. Hamish nodded politely, receiving a quiet smile and a sympathetic glance. The man understood the Highlands better than most, and he knew that gossip, quietly gathered, often revealed more than shouted accusations. Hamish paused to chat briefly, and the conversation yielded a few telling details. Clarissa, it seemed, had spoken scornfully about the parish's Christmas pageant, mocking the children's costumes and critiquing the decorations with a precision that was cruel but revealing. She had not only alienated the locals, but had done so publicly, providing ample reason for resentment, but not necessarily for murder. By mid-morning, Hamish found himself meandering toward the village shop, ostensibly to buy milk, but in reality to listen. Inside, Elspeth Grant was already examining the shelves, her eyes alight with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. She had been visiting Whodunit sporadically over the years, and her keen observation of social undercurrents was something Hamish had learned to respect, even if he rarely admitted it aloud. "Elspeth," he murmured, glancing at the quiet chaos in the village through the frosted windows, "you'll find this situation entertaining in a way that's hardly funny." She smiled, unbothered. "Hamish, it's always entertaining when the English arrive with airs and die under unfortunate circumstances. What's the latest?" Hamish gave her a summary, careful to omit any hint that he already had a theory. Her eyes, however, flickered with understanding, and she offered an insight Hamish had not yet considered. "The problem with the newcomers," she said, leaning casually against a shelf, "is that they misread every subtle cue. They think the village is simple, when in fact everyone is watching everything. Someone probably made a small move, meant to provoke, and it escalated without anyone thinking it would go that far." Hamish nodded. He had observed exactly that: small provocations, minor humiliations, easily overlooked tensions that could, in the right or wrong hands, spark tragedy. He sipped the tea she offered him, listening as she recounted minor encounters with Clarissa, each revealing a detail that seemed trivial until layered together. A scorned remark to the gardener, a harsh critique of Mrs. Biggs' pastries, a heated disagreement over the placement of a wreath. Each interaction left a residue of annoyance that, in the quiet patience of Whodunit, could fester unnoticed. By late morning, Hamish's rounds had taken him back to Heatherbank House. He crouched near the edge of the garden, examining footprints and snow disturbances, with Towser sniffing carefully beside him. The cufflink he had discovered earlier felt heavier in his pocket now, an unassuming yet telling piece of evidence. He noticed a faint trail of mud leading toward the back of the house, toward a shed that seemed innocuous but had likely witnessed more than any of the outwardly visible guests had considered. It was there, crouched beside the shed, that Hamish's attention was drawn to the faintest disturbance in the snow, a partial boot print, smaller than most adult males, angled as though someone had stepped back quickly. He crouched, further, examining the subtle patterns, and noted a smudge of red on the edge of the shed door, a faint, overlooked stain that could easily be disregarded as rust or paint. Not in Whodunit, though. Not to him. As he studied it, he realized something subtle but important. The pattern of movement in the snow suggested a confrontation, brief but tense, that no one had noticed. The killer had been careful, but not careful enough to erase the evidence of panic. And in a village like Whodunit, where every footprint in snow tells a story, panic always leaves a mark. Hamish allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, knowing that while Blair shouted orders and scribbled on clipboards, the real story of the crime was being written in whispers, glances, and footprints. His mind flicked briefly to Clarissa's companion, the tall Englishman who had arrived with her. The man had been polite, even obsequious, but Hamish remembered the way his eyes had darted too quickly toward the gardener, the way his coat had brushed against the uneven snow at Heatherbank's gate. Returning to the village, Hamish paused at Mrs. Biggs's bakery. She was preparing her afternoon tea, a tray of scones steaming beside her, and she handed him a plate with the casual air of someone who knew he would need sustenance. "Hamish," she said softly, "I know you're not the sort to shout or boast, but don't let Blair mislead ye. That man thinks loud words can solve all problems, but the truth is quieter than that." "I ken," Hamish murmured, biting into a scone and letting the sweetness distract him for a moment. "But it's all useful. The snow, the footprints, the way people move when they think no one is watching. That's where the answers hide." By early afternoon, Blair had become increasingly frustrated. He had gathered Dougal and a few other villagers in a semicircle, waving his arms and demanding confessions that never came. Hamish watched from a distance, sipping his now cold tea, and observed the subtle panic. In some of the villagers' eyes, not the kind that comes from guilt, but from fear of being misjudged by someone who could not see nuance. It confirmed what he had suspected. Blair's method was theatrical, and it was failing spectacularly. Hamish's mind returned to the cufflink and the partial footprints near the shed. There was something intimate in the way these small traces had been left, the kind of detail only a patient observer could read. And then it struck him. The motive was unlikely to be greed or revenge in the obvious sense. No, it was more personal, more human, a small petty irritation that had grown into something irreversible. In Whodunit, the quiet resentment of a slighted person could fester unnoticed, just beneath the surface of polite conversation, until the snow fell and covered all traces, except the ones observant eyes could discern. Towser nudged him as if to remind him that the day was not yet done. Hamish adjusted his coat, pocketing the cufflink carefully, and began another slow, deliberate round of the village. Each interaction, each casual remark overheard at the bakery, the post office, or the churchyard was another thread in a tapestry that Blair would never see. By evening, Hamish had begun to piece together the outline of a truth far more intricate than anyone outside Whodunit would suspect. It was not the obvious suspects who held the key. The clues, quiet and deliberate, pointed toward someone careful, who understood the rhythms of the village well enough to blend in while still acting decisively. Hamish's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It was going to take subtlety, patience, and a gentle touch of deception to draw the killer out, but he had learned over the years that subtlety was his greatest ally. As snow drifted again in the fading light, settling over rooftops and fences alike, Hamish allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The investigation was far from over, but he could feel the faintest edges of understanding beginning to align. The village, silent and patient beneath the snow, had begun to reveal its secrets, and Hamish Macbeth, deceptively lazy, would listen carefully, note everything, and in time uncover the truth hidden in the quiet corners of Whodunit. By the following morning, the wind had dropped to a gentle whistle through the rooftops of Whodunit, but the snow lay stubborn and unyielding, thick in the streets and crisp beneath every footstep. Hamish Macbeth wandered at his usual slow pace, Towser padding beside him, ears flicking at the faintest hint of movement in the village. Blair and his team were already making themselves noticed at Heatherbank House, with the inspector's booming voice cutting through the quiet like a saw through timber. Hamish paid no attention. He had learned long ago that the louder the noise, the less truth it contained. Instead, he headed toward the hotel, where he knew he would find Elspeth Grant arranging her small pile of letters and packages at the front desk. "Elspeth," he murmured, leaning lazily against the counter, "you look far too cheerful for a day that started with a murder." She glanced up, her eyes bright, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I don't know, Hamish. Cheerful perhaps, but observant is more accurate. You seem to have inherited my favourite job, quietly noticing things while others shout themselves hoarse. Hamish allowed a faint smile, though he tried to appear distracted by the stack of post. Aye, it's a dangerous occupation. Too much seeing, too much thinking, and then one's reputation is ruined for laziness. She laughed softly. Then let us be careful, shall we? Hamish found himself seated at a small table near the window, Towser curling at his feet, and the two of them began a quiet examination of the village activity. Elspeth spoke freely, mentioning small interactions she had overheard in her brief stroll through the streets, the way the new housekeeper at Heatherbank had flinched when Clarissa's companion spoke sharply to her, the minor spat between a local craftsman and the Sassenach over the placement of festive decorations, and the subtle disdain shown by several villagers when they noticed the newcomers entering shops or markets. Each detail, Hamish knew, was a thread leading somewhere, and the way Elspeth mentioned them, lightly, without accusation, allowed him to see the broader pattern without alerting Blair to any significance. You know, Hamish said quietly, there's more to this than just a snowstorm of rudeness. Someone moved deliberately yesterday. Someone who knew the rhythms of the village, the paths in the snow, the points of visibility. It wasn't random. Elspeth nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. It's petty, isn't it? The motive, I mean. Not grand theft or a fight over money, but small humiliations, irritations that grow into something too large to ignore. It's the sort of thing that would elude someone who only listens to loud accusations. Hamish allowed a thoughtful pause, sipping his tea. He had observed exactly that. The traces left in the snow, the displaced cufflink, the subtle signs of struggle by the shed, all indicated a confrontation small in scope, but precise in execution. Blair, for all his energy and bluster, would see only what he expected. Dougal Fraser, the loud villagers, the first visible targets. Hamish, in contrast, was seeing the human undercurrent, the irritation that escalated, the quiet resentment that erupted like a hidden spring beneath frozen ground. Towser nudged his leg, reminding him that the day was not done. Hamish rose, stretching, and followed a path through the village that took him past the baker, the post office and the churchyard. Each stop provided small but telling observations, Mrs. Biggs whispering to a neighbour about Clarissa's sharp tongue, the minister pausing in contemplation of the snow-dusted graves, a child pointing out a set of footprints that did not match any adult. Hamish filed these carefully, his mind arranging them into a coherent picture, each clue building on the last. By early afternoon, he found himself once more near Heatherbank House, this time at the edges of the garden where the snow had begun to soften slightly under the weak winter sun. The disturbed snow around the shed, the faint smear of red, and the small boot prints all seemed to form a pattern he had not noticed before, a pattern that suggested the killer had moved with purpose, stepping only where necessary and attempting, though imperfectly, to erase evidence. Hamish crouched, examining the snow with meticulous care, noting that the footprints near the cufflink were smaller than most adult males, angled in a manner suggesting retreat rather than approach. It occurred to him then, with a quiet certainty, that the crime was intensely personal. The killer had not acted on impulse in a fit of anger. The act had been deliberate, controlled, and targeted. Someone had been slighted, perhaps humiliated, and had allowed that small human resentment to grow unchecked. The footprint, the cufflink, the displaced snow, they were all marks of a confrontation carefully managed, though not perfectly. Hamish considered Blair's likely course. The inspector would arrive at Heatherbank House shortly, sure that he had cornered the culprit in Dougal Fraser, or one of the more visible villagers, and demand confessions that would never come. Hamish allowed himself a wry smile. Blair would never understand the small, quiet signals, the things people revealed without meaning to, the evidence that was present but disguised as daily life. He returned slowly to the village, observing interactions with the keen eye of a man who knew that every movement, every glance, every hesitation had meaning. A whisper here, a fleeting expression there, the way Clarissa's companion had avoided certain eyes, it all formed part of the mosaic that Blair could not see. And as he passed the bakery, Mrs. Biggs caught his eye and offered a small nod, as if to say, "You see what I see. Keep going." Hamish allowed himself a moment to pause, watching the wind stir the snow along the streets. He thought of Elspeth, the subtle clarity of her observations, and realised that her insight had pointed him towards something he might otherwise have missed. The human element, the petty, personal spark that had ignited tragedy. Blair would never consider such subtlety. He would see only anger, only greed, only the visible suspects, and miss the quiet truths that mattered far more. Towser nudged him insistently, and Hamish knew the next move was his. He would follow the traces in the snow, question the villagers in the soft, indirect way he had perfected over the years, and continue to weave together the strands of motive and opportunity. The quiet patience of Whodunit, the measured accumulation of small details, would reveal the truth before Blair's noise ever had a chance. As the light began to fade, tinting the snow with shades of grey and pink, Hamish allowed a brief moment of satisfaction. The picture was emerging, and the threads were beginning to form a tapestry he could read. The human irritation, the subtle confrontations, the overlooked details, they all pointed toward a truth the official investigation would never see. And Hamish Macbeth, slow, deceptively lazy, and careful, would follow it quietly, listening to the village, observing the people, and noting everything. The day ended with him seated again at the Whodunit Arms, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, Towser's head resting on his feet, and a faint smile tugging at his lips. The investigation was far from complete, but he had begun to see the patterns beneath the snow, the rhythm of hidden resentments and small provocations. The next step would require patience, subtlety, and a gentle touch, but Hamish was content. In the Highlands, the quiet always spoke louder than the loud, and he intended to listen carefully until the story revealed itself fully. The following morning, the village of Whodunit awoke under a sky heavy with low-hanging clouds, the snow from previous days beginning to slush underfoot, leaving streets slippery and uneven. Hamish Macbeth moved slowly through the village, Towser padding close, sniffing at every disturbance in the melting snow. The official investigation, predictably, had accelerated in noise but not in insight. DCI Blair had now become convinced that Dougal Fraser had some hidden motive, largely based on the handyman's habit of speaking freely about the newcomers. Blair's team hovered around him like vultures, waiting for a confession that refused to come, and every shouted accusation seemed only to increase Dougal's confusion and the villagers' unease. Hamish, as usual, avoided the centre of the storm, slipping into the quiet corners where gossip and observation mingled. He found himself at the village post office, where Mrs. Duncanson was arranging parcels with her usual efficiency. She greeted him with a barely suppressed smile, as though she too knew that Blair's loud theatrics could never uncover what lay beneath the snow. "Morning, Hamish," she said softly, sliding a small bundle of letters across the counter. "Blair's ready to charge Dougal with the crime of breathing the wrong way, I think, but I doubt that'll hold." Hamish allowed a faint smile. Aye, that's his method. Make noise, hope truth drowns in it. But the quiet always tells more. He let his eyes drift toward the street, noting the subtle movements of villagers as they carried on with their day, each one avoiding Blair's wrathful gaze, yet betraying hints of something else: hesitation, concern, curiosity. His attention was drawn to the faint imprint of a boot leading away from the back of Heatherbank House, partially hidden by melting snow. The print was small, likely belonging to someone accustomed to moving quietly in the village, and it veered toward the shed at the edge of the garden, the place he had already noted as crucial the day before. Hamish crouched briefly, Towser sniffing at the edge of the mark, and his eyes caught a subtle detail, a faint smudge of red at the edge of the doorframe. Not accidental, not from casual work, but from a moment of panic. Blood, likely, or perhaps paint from the shed door, but important enough to note. As he studied the mark, a voice broke through the quiet. "Hamish, do you ken what you're doing down there? Crouched like a schoolboy avoiding punishment." It was Elspeth Grant, leaning lightly against the shed's frame, hands tucked in her pockets, eyes curious but calm. "Aye, just observing," Hamish replied, rising slowly. "Blair's about to make the biggest mistake of his career, I suspect. Dougal Fraser is no murderer, but the man has the misfortune of being loud and opinionated. That seems to satisfy Blair as reason enough for guilt." Elspeth's eyes sparkled. "And you? You think someone else moved quietly, deliberately, left just enough evidence to mislead the obvious suspect?" Hamish nodded. "Exactly. Look at this," he said, indicating the bootprint and smudge. "Someone intended to be seen, but not in a way Blair will recognise. It's subtle, human. the sort of thing you'd miss if you shouted at it instead of observing. They moved together back toward the village green, where Blair's red face was already rising in a crescendo of accusations. The inspector had gathered a small crowd, pointing aggressively at Dougal and demanding an immediate explanation. You're our prime suspect. Confess now, or—" Hamish watched from a discreet distance, noting the way villagers shifted uncomfortably under Blair's glare. The community had begun to close ranks subtly. The obvious target, Dougal, appeared bewildered but compliant enough to avoid escalation. Blair, however, interpreted confusion for guilt, and he stepped closer, voice booming, finger jabbing the snow. All theatrics, and no subtlety. Hamish allowed himself a slow, thoughtful sip of coffee from a flask he carried, then motioned Towser to lead him slightly away. It was time to draw out the truth quietly. He made his way to Mrs. Biggs's bakery, where the comforting aroma of fresh bread and scones suggested a temporary refuge from the chaos. Mrs. Biggs greeted him with a warm smile, offering a plate of shortbread. "You'll need sustenance," she said knowingly. "Blair's storm will only grow louder before he notices the truth hiding in quiet corners." Hamish accepted the offering and leaned against the counter, his gaze sweeping the street beyond the window. It occurred to him that the red mark, the boot print, the cufflink he had collected, all were subtle threads pointing toward the real motive. He remembered the small provocations Clarissa had offered to the village, harsh words to the gardener, criticisms of Mrs. Biggs' pastries, public disparagement of local crafts, and sharp comments to the church and the shopkeepers. Someone had taken offence, but it was not a grand vendetta. No, it was something petty, deeply personal, and easily overlooked by outsiders like Blair. He left the bakery after a few quiet exchanges with villagers, each conversation revealing more. The way a child had witnessed the Sassenach snapping at a cat, the gardener's discomfort when Clarissa's companion appeared unexpectedly in the yard, the subtle shift in the caretaker's expression when recalling minor disputes over Heatherbank House's decorations. Every small detail was a brushstroke on the canvas of motive. By mid-afternoon, Hamish returned to the edge of Heatherbank House, crouching near the shed once more. He examined the boot prints carefully, noticing for the first time a faint indentation that suggested someone had tried to cover their movements hastily. The cufflink, once held in his pocket, now rested in his hand. Its engraving was delicate, unmistakably tied to a family known for subtle influence in the area, but it could not be traced to anyone in the village. The combination of these small clues, the careful movements, the human irritations, and the deliberate misdirection, pointed clearly towards someone with knowledge of both village rhythms and the vulnerabilities of the newcomers. Towser growled softly, nudging Hamish to follow him along a narrow path toward the back gate. There, partially, hidden beneath a shrub, Hamish discovered a scrap of fabric, threadbare and dark, slightly damp from the melting snow. It was insignificant to anyone else, but to him it confirmed a theory forming in his mind. The crime was not opportunistic, not spontaneous. It was deliberate, carried out with precise knowledge of when and where the victim would be vulnerable, and guided by resentment rather than greed. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the village, Hamish allowed himself a moment to assess. Blair, loud and insistent, would soon announce his intention to arrest Dougal Fraser. It was the perfect moment for the red herring to play its part. The authorities would be satisfied with the obvious suspect, while the real perpetrator moved unnoticed, confident that their careful planning had concealed them. Hamish, sipping his now lukewarm coffee, allowed a faint smile to tug at the corners of his mouth. He understood the danger, yes, but he also knew the village better than any outsider. Every quiet observation, every overlooked detail, every subtle human reaction was a tool he could use. The game was entering its next phase, drawing the killer out, exposing the hidden motive, and ensuring the innocent would not be punished. As night began to settle over Whodunit, blanketing the village in soft darkness, Hamish Macbeth paused at the corner of the green. The snow, now slushy and imprinted with footprints of the day's comings and goings, told a story that only someone patient, observant, and deceptively lazy could read. He took a final sip of coffee, adjusted Towser's collar, and set his mind on the next step. Blair might bluster, villagers might whisper, but Hamish knew the truth was already revealing itself, in the quiet, careful traces left behind. And when the right moment came, the delicate balance of petty grievances, careful movements, and human error would unravel in his favour, though, as always, he would ensure the credit went elsewhere. The quiet patience of Whodunit was on his side, and Hamish Macbeth, slow but infinitely perceptive, was ready. The day broke over Whodunit with the sky a pale, washed-out grey, the snow from previous days now slushy underfoot, reflecting the soft light in a way that made the village feel almost suspended between two worlds, quiet, cold, and deceptively calm. Hamish Macbeth moved at his usual deliberate pace, Towser padding loyally beside him, ears flicking at every faint sound. Blair and his team were already at Heatherbank House, gesturing wildly and insisting Dougal Fraser confess to a crime he had neither committed nor conceived. The inspector's booming voice carried across the green, bouncing off the snow and rooftops, but Hamish paid little attention. He had learned long ago that the noise of others rarely contained truth, and it was in the quiet, the unnoticed, the casually observed, that real information revealed itself. Hamish's first stop was the post office, where Mrs. Duncanson greeted him with a knowing glance. "You've seen the inspector's parade already, I ken," she said, tucking a letter into the rack. "Dougal's frightened half to death, but he's no more guilty than the snow is warm." "Aye," Hamish murmured, taking the tin of shortbread she offered him. "Blair's about to pin everything on Dougal. I'd almost admire the confidence if it weren't so loud." She smiled faintly. "Confidence without sense, Hamish, that's all it is." Hamish nodded, pocketing a few biscuits, and let his gaze drift toward the village streets. Small interactions, subtle glances, and the faintest hesitations in movement told stories the inspector would never notice. It was precisely these stories that mattered. He had a sense of where the puzzle pieces might fall, but someone needed to be carefully nudged into revealing more, and for that, a trap was necessary. He wandered toward Heatherbank House, Towser padding silently at his heels, and approached the back garden from the side. The shed, where he had discovered the subtle boot prints, and the faint smear of red, had been undisturbed since yesterday, and the snow around it now bore the tracks of Blair's overzealous team, creating a chaotic overlay that made the genuine footprints harder to see, but not to Hamish. He crouched, examining the mix of impressions, and noted how the pattern suggested someone had returned to the shed after the initial confrontation, likely to retrieve or replace something. The solution, Hamish realised, was to exploit the killer's confidence, to let them believe their careful movements had left no trace. He considered the villagers he had spoken to, the subtleties he had observed, nervous smiles, half-truths, and the almost imperceptible tension in the air. He decided to plant a minor, deliberate discrepancy, a small rumour about a piece of jewellery found near the shed, trivial but likely to provoke a reaction in someone hiding guilt. He began with Mrs. Biggs, who was sweeping her shop floor. "Ye know," he said casually, "someone's mentioned finding a little trinket near Heatherbank yesterday. Nothing serious, but it might be important. Folks are talking, though none of them would dare mention it to Blair." Mrs. Biggs tilted her head, a faint sparkle in her eyes. "Oh, Hamish. That'll stir more than a pot of stew. Folks do love to talk about secrets when they think they're clever." "Aye," Hamish said, finishing the shortbread and pocketing the crumbs. "Sometimes cleverness is the very thing that gives folk away." He moved then to the post office, delivering a similar hint to Mrs. Duncanson and letting it drop casually, as though it had been mentioned by some passing stranger. The key, he knew, was to let it circulate organically, to let the guilty party react without realising they were revealing themselves. By late morning, the village was alive with quiet tension. Blair, oblivious to the undercurrent he had stirred, continued to point at Dougal Fraser, demanding explanations that never came, his face red and contorted with frustration. Hamish, in contrast, observed the small, telling reactions from the crowd. A flinch here, a sideways glance there, and most importantly, a subtle tremor in the hand of Heatherbank House's new housekeeper, who was otherwise careful to maintain composure. It was a small gesture, a barely perceptible hesitation when a villager mentioned the supposedly found trinket, that drew Hamish's attention. He crouched slightly, Towser settling beside him, and studied the housekeeper's expression. Her eyes darted involuntarily toward the shed, and her lips pressed into a thin line. It was not fear of the police. No, Blair's threats were too obvious, but the fear of being caught in a lie. Someone with secrets, careful but human, was revealing herself in the smallest of ways. Hamish decided to press subtly. He approached, keeping his voice low and gentle. "Aye, you've noticed the chatter, have you? The small trinket near the shed? Nothing serious, but people are interested." The housekeeper's hand twitched, and she looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Hamish allowed a faint smile. "Nothing to worry about, but it's always best to be honest with oneself. It makes life simpler in the long run." She swallowed, a small nod escaping her, and Hamish could feel the tension shift. The trap was working. The rumour had acted like a small pebble in the still waters, creating ripples that revealed what had been carefully hidden. Meanwhile, Blair continued to bluster, convinced that Dougal Fraser was about to confess under pressure. Hamish observed quietly, noting the inspector's impatience, the sergeant's discomfort, and the way villagers were beginning to whisper among themselves, watching reactions and gestures that only a careful observer could interpret. He sipped from his flask, enjoying the faint warmth and the slow unfolding of events. Toward mid-afternoon, the final piece fell into place. The housekeeper, believing the trinket to be discovered by someone else, could no longer contain herself. She approached the shed under the guise of tidying, only to pause at the door, glance furtively around and, almost instinctively, reach to adjust something hidden inside. Hamish, standing at a distance with Towser alert beside him, observed the movement. It was the confirmation he needed. The person who had manipulated the events, the one who had acted deliberately during Clarissa Fairclough's confrontation, was finally revealing herself. The subtlety of her movements, the slight tremor in her fingers, and the glance toward the crowd, all told Hamish what Blair would never see. This was the guilty party. She had acted out of petty resentment, carefully orchestrated in the quiet knowledge that the snow would cover the traces, that the villagers would remain discreet, and that outsiders would misinterpret every sign. But Hamish had seen it all, as he always did. He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, patting Towser lightly on the head. The trap had worked perfectly. The guilty party had moved exactly as he had predicted, guided by the instinct to hide but betrayed by human impulses too subtle for anyone else to notice. Blair, meanwhile, was still preparing to drag Dougal Fraser towards some imagined confession, oblivious to the truth unfolding in plain sight. Hamish took a deliberate step forward, his movements casual, unassuming, but precise. "Aye," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "Sometimes the quietest actions speak the loudest. And in Whodunit, the snow and the silence always tell more than shouting ever could." Towser wagged his tail faintly, as if in agreement, and Hamish Macbeth, deceptively lazy and always observant, allowed himself to feel the faint thrill of the trap set, the first clear victory in a case that had begun with bluster, snow, and a tragedy that had unsettled the village. The confrontation was approaching, though Blair would never know it, and Hamish intended to. Ensure that the truth, subtle and deliberate, would be revealed without the need for the inspector to recognise it at all. The quiet patience of the Highlands, the soft murmur of villagers, and the deceptive calm of the snow were all on his side. And as the late afternoon light softened into the pale glow of early evening, Hamish knew that the next step, the confrontation, subtle but decisive, was only a matter of timing. The evening settled over Whodunit with a faint chill that crept through coats and scarves, and the last vestiges of sunlight glinted off the melting snow, leaving the village in a muted, almost eerie glow. Hamish Macbeth moved deliberately through the streets, Towser padding silently at his heels, ears twitching at every faint noise. The day had been long, filled with observation and careful manipulation of whispers, and now it was time to act. Blair, predictably, was still droning on outside Heatherbank House, preparing to drag Dougal Fraser into what he believed would be a triumphant confession. Hamish ignored him, knowing the real confrontation would unfold far from the inspector's bluster. He circled Heatherbank's garden, noting the subtle shadows cast by the low evening sun across the snow-dusted lawn. The footprints, smudged and distorted by passing feet and melting slush, still betrayed the careful movements of the guilty party. Hamish crouched beside the shed, where the faint red smudge and the cufflink had first caught his attention. Towser nosed the edges, alert but calm, as Hamish's eyes swept over every detail. The housekeeper, whom he had carefully watched and whose small, nervous gestures had betrayed more than words, was somewhere nearby, likely unaware that her behaviour had already exposed her intentions. Hamish did not need theatrics. His approach was quiet, subtle, and precise, qualities Blair could never appreciate. He knew the right words and the right timing could provoke the killer into revealing herself without a struggle, though. He also trusted that, if necessary, he could rely on his own strength. The housekeeper moved near the shed, glancing nervously over her shoulder, fidgeting with her gloves, unaware that Hamish and Towser were observing. "Aye," Hamish called softly, stepping out of his hiding spot. "Sometimes it's the smallest details that give folk away." The housekeeper froze, eyes wide, recognizing the slow, deliberate approach of the constable she had underestimated for days. Towser gave a low, warning growl, but Hamish raised a hand, indicating calm. He allowed himself a faint, reassuring smile. No need for haste, just a quiet word, that's all. Her lips pressed into a thin line and she took a small step backward, almost instinctively, toward the shed. I don't know what you mean," she whispered, voice trembling slightly. Hamish tilted his head, letting his eyes wander over her posture, her hands, and the faint tremor in her fingers. "Aye, you've been careful. Too careful, perhaps. But even the quietest movements leave a trace. The cufflink in the snow, the smudge on the shed, the footprints, they all tell a story. And stories, ye ken, are stubborn things. They don't disappear just because folk hope they will." Her hands twitched, and in a sudden panic gesture, she bent toward the shed, as though to remove or adjust something. Towser barked sharply, the sound slicing through the quiet evening. The housekeeper flinched, eyes darting wildly, and Hamish saw his moment. "Easy," he said calmly, stepping closer, but with deliberate slowness. "No need for foolishness. I only want the truth." Her panic became more evident. She attempted to flee around the side of the shed, but Hamish was quicker. With a swift, quiet step, he intercepted her, gently but firmly guiding her away from the shadows and into the open. "Ah, ye thought ye'd be clever, hiding in plain sight," he murmured, his voice low and measured. "But cleverness is no shield against observation, especially in Whodunit." The housekeeper's composure broke entirely. She stumbled, hands clenching at her coat, and her face turned pale. "I didn't mean, she stammered, words trailing off in frustration and fear. Hamish crouched slightly, maintaining calm authority. He acted out of spite, petty resentment. He thought no one noticed the little provocations, the slights, the criticisms. But I noticed. And the snow, well, the snow doesn't lie. Towser padded closer, nose twitching, as if confirming the constable's words. The housekeeper's shoulders sagged. She could no longer maintain the pretense. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't mean..." She deserved it. She humiliated me. Everyone laughed at my mistake, at my incompetence. I just wanted her to understand, to feel something as I felt. Hamish listened, the quiet patience of the Highlands, reading her words, her body language, every pause and tremor. "Aye," he said softly, "I understand. And now ye must take responsibility. The village, the snow, and the truth have all witnessed what occurred. There's no hiding it, not from yourself, not from the evidence." She nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes, the gravity of her actions finally sinking in. Yes, I'll tell them. Hamish allowed her to compose herself, giving her a moment of quiet reflection. He knew that any outward confrontation would not only heighten panic, but could lead to mistakes. "Do nothing yet," he murmured. "We need a clear path. Blair will want a confession, but he sees only what he expects. Let him think he is in control while the truth reveals itself." From a distance, Blair's voice rose in another torrent of accusations, this time directed at Dougal, who looked increasingly bewildered and cornered. Hamish observed the scene, noting the perfect irony, the innocent man under pressure, the guilty party revealed subtly by her own panic, and the inspector oblivious to everything. It was, in a way, a perfect orchestration. The housekeeper, guided gently by Hamish, finally agreed to accompany him toward the open courtyard, where Blair was preparing to announce his triumph. The constable's calm authority contrasted sharply with the inspector's bluster. Towser padded beside him, alert but composed, adding to the quiet but undeniable weight of Hamish's presence. Blair turned as Hamish approached, voice booming. Macbeth, have ye caught the culprit? Speak now, or—" Hamish allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Aye, Inspector. Ye might want to watch closely. It seems the truth is simpler than ye suspected." The housekeeper's face, pale and anxious, confirmed the moment. She glanced at Blair, who squinted, confusion flickering across his features. "What? Who? How?" Hamish gestured subtly, and Towser nudged the woman forward gently. She acted out of resentment, of petty anger and humiliation. The cufflink, the footprints, the snow. They tell the story no shouting could ever reveal. The rest, well, you'll have to listen. Blair gaped, face red with frustration, realizing that his assumption, his loud accusations, and his bluster had all been misdirected. The guilty party, revealed quietly and deliberately, stood in plain view, shaking under the weight of Hamish's calm but precise attention. Hamish stepped back slightly, hands raised in a gesture of calm. "Aye, you'll take the credit for the arrest, Blair. But know this, the quiet details, the patience, the observing, that's what revealed the truth. And it's best ye leave the learning of subtlety to someone who spends their life in Whodunit, listening, watching, and letting the snow do its work." Towser gave a soft, approving bark, as if punctuating the lesson. The housekeeper, still trembling, nodded, finally understanding that her carefully hidden actions had been unmasked not by force, but by the constable who knew when to step forward and when to let silence speak. As the evening closed over the village, Hamish Macbeth allowed himself a faint smile. The confrontation had unfolded exactly as he had predicted. The guilty revealed, the innocent unharmed, and Blair left with the vague and uncomfortable realization that not all truths could be shouted into existence. The Highlands, patient and observant, had guided him once more, and the quiet, deceptive cunning of Hamish Macbeth had ensured that justice, subtle, deliberate, and complete, was quietly served. The morning after the confrontation arrived quietly over Whodunit, the wind soft and the snow settling into clean, pristine drifts that sparkled in the weak winter sun. The village felt almost normal again, though whispers still lingered in the corners of streets and shops, delicate reminders of the tragedy and its sudden, unceremonious resolution. Hamish Macbeth moved slowly through the village, Towser padding silently beside him, ears flicking at the faintest sounds. Blair, of course, was already at Heatherbank House, strutting about with the victorious air of a man who believed he had solved the case entirely by his own intellect. Hamish, knowing better, kept his distance, allowing the inspector to parade while he savoured the quiet satisfaction of a job well done without ostentation. The housekeeper, now subdued and quietly remorseful, had been escorted under Hamish's calm supervision to State Blair, who naturally took full credit, pacing and gesticulating as if his booming voice had uncovered the subtle threads Hamish had observed for days. Dougal Fraser, relieved and still looking bewildered, was left to shake his head in disbelief at the inspector's theatrics, and the villagers watched from windows and doorways, half amused, half relieved. It was precisely as Hamish intended, the truth revealed, justice served, and yet the spotlight safely elsewhere. Hamish wandered into the Whodunit Arms, the comforting aroma of coffee and simmering stew welcoming him like an old friend. Towser padded to his usual corner by the fire, curling up and letting out. A faint, satisfied sigh. Elspeth Grant was behind the counter, arranging a small tray of scones and sandwiches, and she greeted Hamish with a subtle, knowing smile. "Well, Hamish," she said softly, "the village survives, the guilty have confessed, and Blair takes the glory. Did it unfold as you planned?" "Aye," Hamish murmured, accepting a steaming cup of coffee and settling into a chair near the window. The truth, quiet as it is, did its work, and the loud voice, well, it can have the applause. Elspeth laughed softly, pouring herself a cup. "I suppose some things never change. You, content to sit and watch Blair, satisfied by the sound of his own voice. And the village, untouched for now by the chaos outsiders bring." Hamish sipped his coffee, letting the warmth seep through him, and watched the snow-laden village beyond the frosted glass. Heatherbank House seemed peaceful, almost incongruous given the events of the past days. He noted the faint footprints still visible in the softened snow, reminders of careful movements and human errors, and allowed himself a faint smile. The patterns had revealed the truth long before Blair's loud declarations. and the subtlety of observation had done its work without fanfare. Towser stirred at his feet, tail flicking, reminding Hamish that life, even after disruption, had a comforting rhythm. He had managed the village, the guilty party, and the investigation so delicately that no one had suffered unnecessarily. Even Blair, red-faced and booming, had unwittingly played his part in maintaining the illusion of authority, blissfully unaware that the constable he had belittled had quietly orchestrated the resolution. As the day wore on, villagers began to emerge, cautiously at first, exchanging soft greetings and stolen glances. Mrs. Biggs, carrying a tray of scones to the post office, nodded to Hamish in passing, a silent acknowledgement of his quiet triumph. The gardener, relieved that Dougal was exonerated, tipped his hat as he passed, and the children played carefully in the soft snow, unaware of the human drama that had passed like a shadow over their streets. The village breathed again, steady and unhurried, guided by the subtle rhythm of Highland life that Hamish had long relied upon. Hamish spent the afternoon wandering slowly through the village, checking in with familiar faces, accepting soft smiles, and sharing quiet words with those he trusted. He observed minor details, a window slightly ajar where the wind now rattled, a mailbox that needed attention, and the way shadows shifted across the snow-dusted cottages. In these small, mundane acts, he found comfort, the familiar pace of Whodunit restoring itself after disruption. Eventually, he returned to the Whodunit Arms, Towser padding beside him, ears twitching at the faint creak of the floorboards. He settled near the stove, coffee and a plate of stew before him, and allowed himself to savour the quiet victory. Blair's voice could be heard faintly from the street, still recounting his supposed brilliance, but Hamish paid no attention. The village knew the truth in ways the inspector could never grasp, and that was sufficient. Elspeth approached with a fresh cup of tea, placing it gently on the table. "You've done well, Hamish," she said softly, "though you'll never admit it outright." Hamish allowed a faint wry smile. "Aye," he said quietly. "Some things are best kept between the snow, the village, and the quiet observer." Towser stretched, flicked an ear toward the fire, and then settled back at Hamish's feet, content. The constable leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the window at Heatherbank House, now calm and seemingly ordinary. He thought of the threads he had followed, subtle irritations, hidden resentments, human error, and careful observation. Each had played its part, and each had been crucial. Blair, of course, would receive all the applause, but Hamish preferred it that way. The Highlands had a rhythm of their own, and he intended to remain part of it, quietly and unassuming, enjoying the small comforts of coffee, stew, and the satisfaction of work done well without the burden of fame. As the snow began to glisten in the fading light, casting soft shadows across the village, Hamish allowed himself a deep, contented sigh. Whodunit had returned to its steady pace, and he, its deceptively lazy constable, could resume his careful, unhurried life. Justice had been served, the guilty confronted, and the innocent spared. The village hummed quietly around him, and he knew that, despite the chaos of recent days, the rhythm of Highland life would endure, patiently and unwaveringly. Hamish Macbeth lifted his cup, glanced down at Towser with a faint smile, and murmured, almost to himself, "Aye, this is the life, lad, quiet, steady, and with the truth tucked where no one else would think to look." And with that, he allowed himself to settle fully, the snow outside reflecting the pale evening light, the village peaceful once more, and the constable content in the knowledge that he, slow and deceptive as ever, had preserved the subtle balance of Whodunit, where quiet observation mattered far more than loud accusations, and where Hamish Macbeth could always remain exactly where he wished, at home. The evening settled over Whodunit like a soft woolen blanket, the last remnants of snow glittering under the pale winter light. The village, restored to its familiar rhythm, seemed almost untouched by the recent turbulence, though faint whispers of gossip still danced between cottages, the post office, and the shop fronts. Hamish Macbeth moved slowly along the main street, Towser padding beside him, nose twitching at the lingering sense of smoke and baking. For a brief moment he allowed himself to relish the quiet, knowing full well that the chaos had been resolved, long before Blair's booming proclamations of triumph. Blair, of course, had claimed full credit. The inspector's red face and overinflated sense of accomplishment were on display outside Heatherbank House, regaling the villagers with tales of his brilliant deduction. Hamish allowed a faint smile, sipping his coffee from the Whodunit arms, savouring the warmth more than the absurdity of Blair's self-aggrandizement. The real satisfaction was quieter. The guilty party had been cornered, not by shouting, threats, or the inspector's theatrics, but by subtle observation, a carefully laid rumour, and the patience to wait for human nature to betray itself. The housekeeper, pale and trembling, had been guided gently through her confession, every detail of the petty grievances and long-held resentments revealed without the need for dramatics. Hamish had watched her carefully, recognising the moment when she could no longer maintain her composure. She had acted out of resentment and humiliation, not malice or greed, and he had ensured that the revelation was complete but gentle. Blair, oblivious to the layers of subtlety, had taken the glory, praising his own keen insight, while Hamish remained quietly in the background. He allowed himself to wander the village streets, noting the small signs of recovery. Children played carefully in the slush. Mrs. Biggs replaced a stack of fresh scones in her shop, and the gardener went about his work with a relieved expression. Even Dougal Fraser, the innocent man almost accused, had returned to his routine, head shaking faintly at Blair's continued bluster. Hamish felt the familiar satisfaction of knowing the village was safe, the guilty exposed, and the innocent protected. Towser nudged him gently, and Hamish's eyes settled on the soft glow of the hotel's window. Elspeth Grant stood behind the counter, offering a small smile, her eyes acknowledging his quiet triumph. "The village owes you more than it will ever say," she murmured, pouring a cup of tea. Hamish shrugged, allowing his lazy exterior to mask the satisfaction he felt. "Aye, it does, but no one needs to know who really solved it. Best Blair thinks he did, keeps the peace, and keeps me here." She laughed softly, the sound warm and light in the quiet of the evening. "You've done it again, Hamish." Quietly, cleverly, without upsetting the balance of the village. "Whodunit is lucky to have you." Hamish allowed a faint, wry smile. Lucky, perhaps, or maybe just persistent. He raised his cup in a small private toast, to the snow that never lied, to the village that watched and whispered, and to the patience that always revealed the truth. As the night deepened and the village lights twinkled softly against the darkened hills, Hamish returned to his favourite chair by the stove, Towser curling at his feet. The stew was warm, the coffee comforting, and the world outside carried on with the quiet rhythm of the Highlands. The case was closed, the guilty confronted, and Blair blissfully unaware of how thoroughly he had been outmanoeuvred. Hamish Macbeth leaned back, eyes drifting toward the frosted window, listening to the soft murmur of the village. He thought of petty grievances, hidden resentments, and the small human errors that had brought the mystery to light. Justice, subtle and deliberate, had been served, not by loud accusations, not by authority, but by patience, observation, and quiet understanding of human nature. Towser sighed, nestling closer, and Hamish allowed himself a deep, contented breath. The village was safe, the guilty accounted for, and the everyday rhythm of Whodunit, slow, steady, unpretentious, had been preserved. There would be more cases, more disruptions, and more opportunities for chaos to ripple through the Highlands, but for now, all was well. And Hamish, deceptively lazy, quietly clever, and perfectly attuned to the human heartbeat of his village, could remain exactly where he wanted to be, at home in Whodunit, watching, observing, and sipping his coffee while the world continued its slow, steady Highland rhythm around him. Justice had been done subtly, patiently, and perfectly. And in Whodunit, that was more than enough. The snow fell softly again that night, undisturbed, as if it too approved of the resolution, and Hamish Macbeth, the quiet observer, the understated constable, finally allowed himself to relax fully, confident that the village and the delicate balance of its secrets was safe once more.